even now, tears are coming out of my eyes from my being here.
Clarence Earl Gideon couldn't afford a lawyer, and after a swift, one-sided trial, he was sent to prison without a proper defense. Reuben Hurricane Carter, a celebrated boxer, was wrongfully convicted on lies and prejudice. Turns out there are more innocent people wrongly convicted in the 60s. Here they are. Clarence Earl Gideon. Picture yourself standing alone in a hot Florida courtroom in 1961, shirt damp, palms sweating, the smell of old wood and chalk dust mixing with the thick summer air. You can feel every eye on you. You don't know the rules, don't know the language they speak in here, and you definitely don't know how to save your own life. That was Clarence Earl Gideon, just a poor man with holes in his pockets, accused of a pool hall break-in that he insisted he didn't commit. When he asked the judge for a lawyer, something you and I assume is automatic, the judge just shook his head. Florida only assigned lawyers for capital cases back then. Everything else, you were on your own. Imagine the sting in your chest if someone told you, at the moment you needed help most, no, figure it out yourself. So Gideon tried. He questioned witnesses the way anyone without training would, awkwardly, clumsily, hoping truth would be enough. He made his own opening statement, his own closing, and when the jury found him guilty, it wasn't evil or malice that sealed it. It was the simple reality that a human being without legal training can't stand toe-to-toe with a system built by experts. Now, imagine the silence of his cell that first night. That kind of silence eats into you. It makes you replay every word you said, every word you didn't know to say. You can almost feel the ache he felt, lying on that thin prison mattress, realizing the system didn't fail accidentally, it failed predictably. But here's where something inside him sparked. Instead of giving up, Gideon picked up a pencil and wrote a letter, handwritten, shaky, but stubborn, to the United States Supreme Court. Think about that. You ever send a message you weren't sure anyone would read? Imagine sending one to the highest court in the country. And imagine them actually listening. His case became a question that changed everything. Does every person accused of a serious crime deserve a lawyer, even if they can't afford one? When the Supreme Court ruled yes, it wasn't just a legal victory, it was a seismic shift. A message that the poor weren't disposable. Gideon got a new trial, with a real lawyer this time. And the jury acquitted him in under an hour. 1 hour to undo 5 years of damage. And you can't help but wonder, if a man with a pencil and a prison envelope could change the entire structure of American justice, what unseen strength is sitting inside you right now? James Dean Walker. Imagine the smell of cigarette smoke clinging to your clothes, the low rumble of late-night conversations drifting out of a bar, and that hazy, restless feeling you get when you're young and moving through the world without a clear direction. That's the setting James Dean Walker stepped into on April 16th, 1963. A night that should have been unremarkable, but instead became the moment his life veered off a cliff. Walker was only 22 years old, a kid still figuring out who he was, still carrying the chipped edges of a rough childhood and a collection of wrong crowd influences. You know, that insecure, in-between stage where adulthood hasn't fully settled into your bones. That's where he was standing when everything erupted. It started with an argument inside a bar in North Little Rock. Voices rising, chairs scraping. The kind of bad energy you can feel before anything even happens. When Walker stepped outside with his companion, he probably felt that tension still buzzing under his skin. Then came the flashing police lights, the command voices, the split second where everything becomes confusion and instinct. Your heart beats faster just imagining it. Shots rang out, glass shattered. Somewhere in the chaos, an officer fell, and here's the detail that makes your stomach drop. The gun found in Walker's hand, the piece of evidence that should have mattered most, was fully loaded, unfired. Ballistics confirmed it over and over. Physically impossible for him to have pulled the trigger that killed the officer. But, in the confusion of the moment, with an officer dead and emotions running hot, truth became an inconvenience. Someone had to take the fall. Someone had to be punished. And Walker, young, outmatched, and easy to villainize, became that someone. You can almost feel the cold dread that must have moved through him when the trial began. Picture yourself sitting in a courtroom as prosecutors paint a version of you that doesn't match who you are. They point, they narrate, they twist the story until even you could start doubting what happened. That's the quiet psychological horror of a wrongful conviction. It makes you feel erased while still being alive. Walker was sentenced to death at first. Death. Before it was later changed to life in prison. Can you imagine lying in a prison bunk at 22, thinking about the needle? Thinking about time running out while you didn't even fire a shot? Years later, suppressed evidence surfaced. Judicial bias was exposed. A diary hinted that the fatal shot may have come from someone else entirely. Piece by piece, the truth crawled back into daylight. Walker's conviction was overturned in 1985, more than 20 years after the night that ruined him. But by then, freedom didn't feel like victory. It felt like stepping into a world that had moved on without him. And it makes you ask yourself, if one chaotic night could reshape a man's entire existence, how many moments in your own life came dangerously close to turning into tragedies you never even saw coming? George Whitmore Jr. Picture being 19 years old again, awkward, hopeful, unsure of your place in the world, with a kind of innocence you don't even realize you have until the world decides to take it from you. Now, imagine walking down a Brooklyn street in 1964, minding your own business, the city buzzing around you. Car horns, kids playing on stoops, radios humming soul music from open windows, when suddenly a stranger points at you and everything freezes. That was George Whitmore Jr. One moment a quiet teenager, the next moment a suspect, then a criminal, then a headline. You know that strange feeling of being misunderstood by someone close to you? Now amplify that into an entire police department deciding you look kinda like someone they were hunting. Whitmore didn't stand a chance. He was young, black, soft-spoken, poor, and alone in a time when those traits made you easy to overlook and even easier to frame. The police dragged him in. No lawyer, no parent. Just a room with walls that felt too close and officers who talked fast, pushed hard, and didn't care about the truth. And if you've ever been pressured so intensely that your brain just shuts down, you already understand how false confessions happen. It's not weakness, it's survival. Fight or flight becomes agree and hope it stops. Hours passed. Stress layered over fear. Whitmore, mentally exhausted, finally broke and signed a confession, one he didn't even understand. You can almost feel the heaviness in his chest when they pushed that piece of paper toward him. He just wanted to go home. Instead, the confession chained him to 3 different crimes he had nothing to do with. Even the victim in the attempted rape case didn't identify him at first. But after police pressure, she changed her mind. That detail sits like ice on your spine, doesn't it? Because it reminds you how fragile memory is, how easily fear can twist recollection, how one uncertain moment from a stranger can determine the next decade of your life. Whitmore's case became famous for all the wrong reasons. His forced confession played a direct role in inspiring the Miranda ruling. Yes, that Miranda ruling. The one that gave you the right to remain silent, the right to an attorney. But while the country moved forward, Whitmore remained stuck. A symbol, a cautionary tale, but still a prisoner. Journalists eventually uncovered evidence that police had withheld critical information, proof he had been misidentified. The truth finally clawed its way out in 1973, nearly 10 years after his nightmare began. His conviction was vacated, but freedom didn't erase what those years took from him. And when you read his story, you feel that tightening in your throat because it forces you to confront something uncomfortable. If you were trapped in a room with people who already decided your fate, how long would you be able to hold on before fear crushed your voice? Muhammad Abdul Aziz and Khalil Islam. Think about the heaviest moment in your life, the moment when the room felt too small, your breath felt too loud, and everything around you seemed to slow down. Now imagine that feeling multiplied by the weight of an entire nation's anger. February 21st, 1965. Malcolm X is assassinated on stage in Harlem, and within hours, the demand for answers becomes deafening. People wanted justice, they wanted names, they wanted someone to blame, and in that rush to fill the void, 2 innocent men, Muhammad Abdul Aziz and Khalil Islam, were caught in the tidal wave. You know how terrifying it is when someone accuses you of something completely untrue? That brief, confusing panic? Now imagine that panic stretching across decades, solidifying into a prison sentence. Aziz and Islam were both members of the Nation of Islam, which made them convenient suspects, not because evidence pointed to them, but because fear needed a shape, and their faces fit the outline. Witness after witness claimed to have seen them, even though physical evidence said otherwise. Alibis were ignored. FBI files that could have cleared both men, were hidden away. Think about that. Imagine sitting in court, watching people swear they saw you somewhere you've never been, while the real evidence sits locked inside a cabinet no one is allowed to open. It's the kind of helplessness that sinks into your bones. You can almost feel the air in the courtroom. thick with tension and expectation. Picture Aziz standing there in 1966, listening to the judge's voice echo across the room, each word like a nail sealing his life shut. Picture Islam watching jurors avoid his eyes because, in their minds, the story was already decided the moment he walked in. And when the judge delivered life sentences, you know that silent, choking feeling, like the world tilted and refused to tilt back. That's what swallowed both men. For decades, Aziz insisted he was at home with a leg injury. Islam insisted he wasn't even in the building. But for decades, no one listened. Their children grew up without them. Their reputations were destroyed. Their names were dragged or tattered through history like stains instead of stories. Then, in 2021, more than 50 years later, hidden evidence finally surfaced. FBI documents revealed suppressed witness statements. Police reports contradicted courtroom testimony. The real shooter had even confessed years earlier that Aziz and Islam weren't involved. Everything the system needed to clear them existed the whole time. It was just buried. Aziz was finally exonerated. Islam, long gone, received his justice only after death. His family left to carry the complicated relief of being proven right far too late. And you feel that ache inside your chest because this story forces you to confront a brutal truth. What happens to a society when clearing an innocent man's name becomes harder than convicting him? Reuben Hurricane Carter. Close your eyes for a second and imagine the sound of a prison door slamming shut. The metallic echo, sharp and cold, vibrating straight through your spine. Now, imagine hearing that sound not once, not 100 times, but thousands of times over 20 years, all while knowing you never committed the crime that stole your life. That was Reuben Hurricane Carter. Before he became a symbol of injustice, he was just a man with fists like lightning, a presence that filled a boxing ring, and a future that looked bigger than the small New Jersey streets he came from. Think of the energy inside a boxing arena, the roar of the crowd, the bright lights, the adrenaline that pulses like electricity under your skin. Carter lived for that. He was intense, focused, disciplined, someone who had clawed his way out of a rough childhood using nothing but willpower and speed. But none of that mattered on the night of June 17th, 1966, when 3 people were shot to death in the Lafayette Bar and Grill. Panic filled the air. Rumors spread like wildfire, and when police couldn't find the real shooters that night, they did what frightened systems often do. They grabbed the nearest story that made sense. Carter, a well-known black boxer with a tough reputation, became the perfect villain for a crime he didn't commit, and you can feel that familiar ache. The way society loves a neat explanation, a quick answer, even if the truth gets lost along the way. Carter and his friend John Artis were pulled over, questioned, and eventually arrested based on shaky eyewitnesses, pressured testimonies, and a narrative the public was desperate to believe. Imagine sitting in a courtroom knowing every piece of evidence is twisted against you. It's the kind of fear that settles into your bones. Prison didn't break Carter's body. It tried to break his mind. He refused to wear prison clothes, refused to play along, refused to let the system crush him into the version of himself they were trying to paint. That defiance landed him in solitary confinement again and again, locked alone in a concrete box with nothing but his breath and his thoughts. If you've ever felt trapped, truly trapped, you understand a fraction of what those days felt like. In 1985, nearly 20 years after being caged, Carter's conviction was overturned. The judge called the original prosecution based on racism rather than reason, and when Carter finally stepped outside as a free man, he wasn't the hurricane the world had known. He was something quieter, deeper, reshaped by survival, and his story leaves you wondering, if truth can take 2 decades to stand up on its feet, how many people never live long enough to see theirs rise at all? John Artis. If you've ever had a single moment reroute your entire life, then you already understand the tragedy that swallowed John Artis. Not a violent moment, not a mistake, just a simple, familiar human moment. The kind where someone says, "Hey, you want to ride home?" And you say yes without thinking twice. That's all it took. One yes, one car ride, one red traffic light glowing over a quiet New Jersey street. And from that point on, John's life was no longer his. Picture being 19. You're just stepping into adulthood, still shaped by the gentle hands of your parents, still proud of the athlete you were in high school, still imagining a future that unfolds slowly and beautifully. You're respectful, you're polite, you're the kind of kid teachers talk about with a smile. Now imagine being plucked straight out of that innocence and dragged into a nightmare you don't understand. On June 17th, 1966, John ran into Reuben Hurricane Carter at closing time. No drama, no tension, just 2 young men heading home. Minutes later, police cars swarmed the intersection like a trap snapping shut, lights blinding, shotguns raised, voices shouting orders. You know that sudden rush of fear when something bad happens too fast to process. That's the exact moment John realized his life could be taken from him in an instant. He and Carter were questioned, tested, released, and for a brief moment, John probably believed the universe had corrected itself. But the universe is not always that generous. Months later, on the eve of his 20th birthday, police kicked in his door, guns shoved in his face. You're under arrest for murder. The final thing he saw was his father staring through the kitchen window, helpless, watching his son disappear into a police car. Imagine standing trial for your life, knowing nothing you say can outweigh a lying witness pointing at you. Imagine hearing the words, "guilty on all counts," and feeling your chest hollow out. John didn't just lose his freedom that day, he lost the sense that truth could protect him. 10 years later, Bob Dylan's Hurricane exploded nationwide, drawing eyes back to the case. Then came the pressure, the appeals, the unraveling of the lies. In 1985, the conviction was overturned. John finally walked free. But the truth is, you don't get your 20s or 30s back. Freedom after innocence stolen isn't victory, it's survival. And John's story forces you to ask, how many pieces of yourself would still be intact if the world tried to bury you before your life even began? James Joseph Richardson. There are some stories that sit heavy on your chest the moment you hear them, and James Joseph Richardson's story is one of them. Picture a warm Florida morning in 1967, the kind where the sun rises gently over small homes, the kind where kids get ready for school while the smell of breakfast lingers in the air. Richardson kissed his children goodbye that morning, not knowing it would be the last, normal moment of his life. You know the way a house feels when laughter is inside it? That's what his home sounded like. 7 children, 7 small voices, 7 futures. By noon, all 7 were dead. Imagine the shock, the frantic screams, the sickening disbelief. Authorities rushed in, confused, overwhelmed, desperate for answers, and when fear meets urgency, it always looks for the nearest place to land. Richardson, a black field laborer in a segregated town, became the target before evidence was even collected. You know that cold dread when someone decides you're guilty before they even hear your side? Multiply that by 1,000. Investigators ignored glaring red flags, ignored Bessie Reese, the neighbor who had a history of poisoning, ignored contradictions, ignored logic. Instead, they clung to a theory that made no sense, that a father poisoned his own children's lunch while he was miles away working in an orange grove. No motive, no opportunity, no physical evidence, just a community stung by grief and a system hungry for closure. In 1989, after 21 years, Richardson walked out of prison, not into celebration, not into justice, but into a world that had moved on without him. His children were gone, his marriage had collapsed under the weight of grief and separation. His youth was gone. And when you think about his story, one truth cuts through. What breaks a man more? The injustice that takes his life, or the years afterward when he has to figure out how to keep living it? Joe Salvati. Some injustices feel like accidents, messy, tragic, heartbreaking. But then there are cases like Joe Salvati's where injustice feels deliberate, engineered, sharpened into a weapon. Imagine being a quiet family man in Boston in 1967. Someone who works hard, keeps his head down, provides for his wife and kids. You're not rich, you're not powerful, you're just ordinary. And sometimes being ordinary makes you invisible in all the worst ways. Now imagine the FBI decides you fit a narrative they need to protect. That's what happened to Salvati. It began with a murder tied to organized crime, a world Salvati wasn't part of. The government relied on Joseph, the Animal, Barboza, an informant with a violent past but a valuable role. He helped the FBI target the mafia, and when someone like Barboza points a finger at you, even falsely, the system tends to lean in his direction. Think about that. Your entire life weighed against the word of a killer being, protected by the government. Salvati was accused of being the getaway driver. The story made no sense. Barboza's testimony changed, contradicted itself, and stretched logic until it snapped. He claimed Salvati wore disguises. He claimed he was involved in planning, but not a shred of evidence backed it. Still, prosecutors loved the narrative. The FBI backed it, and the jury, fed a carefully packaged version of the truth, believed it. Imagine sitting in a courtroom, hearing lies stack up like bricks around you. You want to scream? You want to stand? You want to rip apart the story that's strangling your life. But the system isn't listening. It never was. Salvati was sentenced to life. Life. For a crime he didn't even witness, let alone commit. Years slipped away, holidays missed, children growing up without him, grandchildren he never met. Meanwhile, hidden deep inside federal files were memos naming the actual killers, memos that should have freed him. But the FBI buried them to protect their informants and themselves. Let that sink in. Proof of his innocence existed the entire time. Decades later, everything unraveled when journalists and lawyers dug up the truth. The original police report contradicted Barboza entirely. Federal documents showed the government knew Salvati was innocent, and when the case exploded into public view, it shook the country. Judges condemned the FBI for extreme and outrageous misconduct. Salvati walked free after 30 years, but freedom late is not freedom whole. He returned to a world where his children were grown, where the home he remembered no longer existed, where the justice he deserved was decades overdue. And his story leaves you with a question that lingers like a bruise. What do you do when the very institution meant to protect you becomes the one that destroys you? Peter Limón. Some injustices feel like storms, loud, chaotic, impossible to ignore. But the injustice that swallowed Peter Limón was quiet, methodical, and carried out by men in suits behind closed doors. Imagine waking up every day believing that the system, flawed as it may be, still has a moral floor. Now imagine discovering that floor isn't solid at all, that it can be ripped out from under you without hesitation. That's the world Peter Limón stepped into on a cold night in 1965, when federal agents and state prosecutors began weaving a story that would erase 33 years of his life. Picture Boston in the 1960s, narrow streets lit by yellow lamps, cold air curling off the harbor, the tension of organized crime investigations hanging thick in the atmosphere. Limón wasn't a gangster. He wasn't a hitman. He wasn't even at the scene of the murder he was accused of. He was a quiet bookie, a family man, someone who lived on the periphery of the city's underworld but never crossed into violence. Yet sometimes innocence looks irrelevant when someone else needs protecting. Enter Joseph, the animal Barboza, a ruthless FBI informant whose word carried more weight than truth itself. Think about that. Imagine your life depending on the testimony of a man willing to kill for money, lie for favors, and rewrite entire narratives if it meant staying free. Barboza claimed Limón helped orchestrate a mob killing. He said it confidently, dramatically, convincingly, and the FBI, desperate to shield their own informants from scrutiny, backed him fully. They didn't just ignore evidence of Limón's innocence, they hid it. Imagine sitting through your trial knowing the real killers' names were written on documents the jury would never see. Imagine staring at prosecutors who knew you were innocent but pursued you anyway. You know that sinking, powerless feeling when someone lies about you and the world believes them? Now imagine that feeling stretching into decades. Limón was sentenced to death, later changed to life, 33 years behind bars, 33 birthdays, 33 Christmases, 33 years of watching other prisoners go home while he stayed. You can almost feel that crushing weight in your own chest. The way time becomes a punishment separate from the prison walls themselves. The truth finally surfaced in 2000 when hidden FBI memos were uncovered. Memos naming the actual shooters and proving Limón had been framed as acceptable collateral damage. The judge who released him called the government's actions extreme and outrageous. But even that phrase feels too small. Limón was exonerated, awarded millions, praised publicly, but no amount of money can buy back 33 lost years. No apology can restore the moments he never got to live, and his story forces you to confront the most unsettling question of all. If the government can knowingly bury an innocent man for 3 decades, how many more truths still sit unseen in locked drawers? Louis Greco. Some tragedies feel distant when you read about them, but Louis Greco's story hits differently because it shows how a man can lose everything. Not because of who he was, but because the truth was inconvenient. Imagine being thousands of miles away, standing under the Florida sun, enjoying a warm evening when police up north accuse you of murder in a Boston alley. A murder you didn't witness, a murder you didn't plan, a murder you couldn't physically have committed. That was Greco's life in March 1965. Picture yourself getting the news. Authorities claim you were in Chelsea, Massachusetts, participating in a mob hit, but you were in Florida, with witnesses, with proof, with photographs. Imagine the shock, the disorientation, like someone accusing you of being in 2 places at once and refusing to listen when you show them the evidence. That's the kind of absurdity Greco walked into, but absurd doesn't stop a prosecution determined to win at any cost. Enter Barboza again, the same informant who framed Limón and Salvati. He pointed to Greco in the courtroom, naming him as one of the shooters, even though Greco was over 1,000 miles away recovering from a foot injury at the exact time of the murder. You know that sickening swirl in your stomach when someone lies so boldly that it makes you question reality itself. Imagine hearing that lie dictate the next 30 years of your life. The FBI knew Barbosa was lying. They knew Greco wasn't there. They had memos confirming the real killers. But exposing the truth meant exposing their own corruption, so Greco's innocence became a sacrifice, a casualty of convenience. Greco was sentenced to death, later commuted to life. In prison, the warm Florida sun he once knew was replaced with cold concrete, flickering fluorescent lights, and the metallic slam of cell doors. His health declined. His hope thinned. He filed appeals, wrote letters, begged the courts to look at the evidence they already had, but nothing changed. He survived riots, illness, violence, and despair, not because he was built for prison, but because he was too stubborn to let the truth die with him. But life behind bars takes pieces of you. Greco's health broke long before the system finally did. He died in 1995, still labeled a murderer, still pleading for recognition. It wasn't until 2001, years after his death, that the truth was officially acknowledged. Greco was innocent, completely, undeniably. The state admitted it, the courts admitted it, even the FBI's own buried documents proved it. But by then, Greco wasn't alive to hear the words that should have freed him decades earlier. And his story leaves you with a final haunting question. What does justice mean if it arrives only after the person who needed it is gone? That brings us to the end of this story. For more interesting videos like this, click on the cards on your screen.